Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here today. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You know, you can find out every single thing you might want to know about that show on a little website, which I built all by myself. Check that out at chrisandchristineshow.com. But here is Podtastic Audio. It's like the companion show to that show. It's the show you all wanted to know. How did I make such fantastic audio on the Chris and Christine Show? How did I pull that off? Well, here it is, Podtastic Audio for you. You're welcome. You're all welcome. So today is going to be a very, very special day. You know, it got me thinking that this episode is going to be one that I don't know how many other podcasts about podcasting are talking about. You see, we all want to create an amazing show. We're all podcasters here, and a lot of shows will have guests on their podcast. It's kind of the nature of the game. Eventually, you're going to have a guest on your show. I'm doing a solo show today. Yes, I get that. I've done previous episodes with guests. I've done lots of guests on the Chris and Christine Show. Now, on this podcast, and probably a lot of other shows that also talk about podcasting, they will tell you how to get amazing guests for your podcast. And once you have those amazing guests on your podcast, how to even physically record the interview, and how to have good questions and how to have a good conversation with your guest, and all about which guests to bring on, how to bring them on, how to prep them, all that great, wonderful stuff. But today, I'm going to flip the script. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff. Today, we're going to talk about what it's like being a podcast guest, not the podcaster, but what it's like being the actual guest. What does a guest go through? What does it mean to be a podcast guest? What shows should you choose to be on as a guest? How to prepare for interviews as a guest? And what you kind of should expect being a podcast guest. You see, let's just imagine that you are either an author or an expert, or you have a coaching class, or you're some big shot, who knows, whatever. And you say, you know what? I know podcasting is like really hot right now, so I should go on a lot of podcasts and promote my stuff, whatever it is. Now, where do you start? How do you do that? Well, let's dive in, buckle up, here we go. Now, just because I'm talking about things from a guest perspective, this is going to be very valuable information for the guest and also for the podcaster themselves. You see, if you have a better understanding of what it's like being in the other person's shoes, if you have a better understanding of what it's like being an actual guest for a podcast, then perhaps maybe you can be a better podcaster and be a better interviewer to that guest, because you understand the road they had to go through to get where they're at today and where they're at coming on your show. Okay, so let's just say you have that one thing you want to promote and you want to get on a podcast. Great. So where do you start? How do you figure that out? So whatever you're selling or whatever it is you're doing, you should probably try to find shows that tailor towards your particular topic. You see, if you're an expert in, let's say you're an author that wrote a book on vacuum cleaners. I don't know why I threw it out there, but just say vacuum cleaners were your expertise, right? Then perhaps maybe you want to Google all the vacuum cleaner podcasts that are available. If there are any, I'm sure there are. I don't know, but just throwing it out there. And maybe if you can't find a lot in that category, then branch out a little bit and look in maybe the tech space. Or if you can't find anything in that, then it's got to be something in the home decor, or maybe a Home Depot's got a podcast. Maybe housekeeping's got a podcast. So once you figure out the actual shows that you want to be on, there's a couple things you have to do first right off the bat. First things first, you got to go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Preferably go to Apple if you can. The reason why is for a couple things. One, when you go there, find their show. If you can find their show, assuming it comes up and you do see it, look at all their episodes and try to find the most recent episode and see when it was published. If it was published 2 or 3 years ago, there's a good chance that show is dead and they are not releasing new content at all. I would avoid those shows altogether because they're not doing shows. Why bother going there, right? Now, assuming they did do a show that was pretty recent, say they released an episode a week ago, and maybe they do have guests on their show, great. Go listen to an episode of theirs that they released that had a guest on that podcast. Now, when you listen to the actual episode that they did with a guest, you're listening for sound quality, content. How does the show perform? How does it sound? Is it entertaining? How did they treat the guest? Were they very inviting? Did they get along? Was it boring? Was it a show you would actually listen to? Just kind of get a good feel for what it actually sounds like. So when you do go on, you're not going in total cold turkey here, figuring out what show this is like. Then the second thing you want to do in Apple Podcasts, while you got the thing open on your screen, is scroll down to the very, very bottom. And then you should see all the reviews, 5-star, 1-star, 2-star, whatever it is. Go there and look and see how many reviews they have and see what people are actually talking about when they talk about that particular podcast. Now, if it's a newer show, they may not have a lot of podcast reviews. They may have a few, and maybe from mom and dad, maybe from their cousins. 5 stars, it's great, love the host, yada, yada, yada. See what you can find in there and look at if you see 1-star reviews and someone left actual comment, read those too. The reviews that really are the ones that are really important are probably like the ones in the middle, because it wasn't good enough to leave a 5-star, yet it wasn't bad enough to leave a 1-star. Something in the middle, chances are they probably wrote something like, oh, it was dry material, it was comedy but not funny or something. Who knows? Read those and see if that's a good fit for a show that you might want to go on. Now, there are other ways to actually get booked on podcasts. You can hire an actual company, like a booking company, that will actually kind of pimp you out to all of the different podcasts out there to get you on as many shows as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of them do not really go into the research of what the show is actually about. They will pitch your vacuum cleaner podcast up against a sports podcast and see if you're a good fit, or any kind of podcast, really. Some of the better ones will actually try to pin you in with your particular topic, whatever your show is, whatever you're talking about. They try to match you up accordingly, but you got to pay for these things. And another thing too, you really have no idea how popular or not so popular the show they're booking you on really is. You see, if you're paying somebody to put you on shows and the show they give you has got like a really small audience, you see, the booking firm doesn't really even know that information. They see the same things that we see. They see how many reviews you got in Apple. And if they want to check out listen notes, which isn't always 100% accurate, it's more of like a guide than an exact science, listennotes.com. You can look up any podcast you want. And if they have a score higher than the top 10% of all podcasts that have ever existed, even ones that are dead, if you are ranked within the top 10% or higher, your show will actually be ranked. If you're not, it won't even be ranked. It'll be on there. It won't be ranked. That's another guide that you can use to see whether or not this show is somewhat popular. Now, obviously, if a show is showing top 0.1% or 1%, then it's somewhat popular. People do listen. There's 2 really key factors here to see whether a show is fairly popular or not. One is you can look at their social media and find out how many followers they actually have. All their accounts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is, YouTube. Look at all their social media and see if they have followers. Now, if they have followers, then they might be somewhat popular. The second thing you obviously can do is look at listen notes and see if they're actually ranked. A lot of the data for listen notes gets from actual reviews across the World Wide Web. So the more reviews you have, the higher you can be ranked on listen notes. Now, it does not mean you have a million listeners to your podcast. That's not true. It just means you have social proof that people do listen to your podcast. And if you're looking at things from the outside as a potential guest to come on a show, every little bit of this, it will help you make a decision whether or not you want to be on that podcast or not. Listen to them and do a little homework first. Okay, so let's just say you found that show you want to be on, and great. How do you contact them? Well, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can possibly reach out on social media, but you got to be careful because a lot of these social media platforms will actually block messages that are from people that you do not subscribe to or follow. So this message may fall on deaf ears if you're trying to send it to the podcaster and they don't get right back to you. Another way you can do it is if you can figure out a way to get a hold of their email. A lot of independent podcasts like myself will actually post publicly our email for the show because we want people to write in. We want people to be guests. We want people to ask questions or have any comments or concerns, whatever it is. It's always good to have some form, some contact form, whether it's built into your website or it's just an email itself, somewhere on your on the podcaster's website. Hopefully there's a contact form. Find that, and then you have to write a really good reason why that you would make a really good fit for their podcast as an interview guest. Now, if you've been a guest on previous podcast episodes and they went amazingly well, the audio was great, everything sounded fantastic, maybe you can drop those links in your messaging, in your email to the podcast you want to be on. People love proof of concept. It's the same reason why people leave reviews and people love reviews. It's social proof. Now, proof that you can actually be a good guest would be, here's an example of the podcast I was on. Check it out. I would be a good fit for your show. Here you go. This way, the potential podcaster could have a little information about you other than the fact you wrote them an email. It's always good to have actual physical evidence proving that you can carry your own weight and actually produce really good content for a podcast. Okay, now assuming you have already agreed to go on a podcast, they like you, you like them. Now, how do you figure out a day and time on how to do that? There is a lot of different ways to schedule people to do interviews. I like to use Calendly. It's probably the most popular version. I believe there is a free one you can get. I'm on the paid version, which allows me to book multiple calendars and multiple events and simultaneously and things like that. I think Google has got one with their Google Calendar. I think Apple's got one too or something. There's lots of different ways to actually schedule and book guests for your show. Assuming you got all that figured out and you're ready to rock and roll and be on that show, there's going to be some basic information that you're going to want to know about the podcast interview other than the day and time. Well, you're going to want to know, is it video? Which platform are we going to use? Is it audio only? Which platform are we going to use? And hopefully the podcaster or podcast show is very clear in all of those details. Hopefully, if they did a really good job getting you on the show, perhaps in their Calendly or maybe some kind of intake email they sent out to you kind of goes over everything they expect and everything that they're going to do, whether it's audio, video, what platform, if it's a Zoom link, send you the link in advance. All that stuff hopefully gets figured out well in advance before the interview, not the day of. But as a podcast guest going on a lot of different shows, you really do not know what you're going to be walking into, especially if this podcaster gives you no information ahead of time. If you're walking into a show totally blindfolded, you don't know if it's audio or video or what it is, then it's really on the podcast show to tell you these things. But as a podcast guest, you really do not know what you're walking into. So this is important here. You really have to be prepared for anything and everything. Now, the podcaster hosting the interview may or may not know anything about you. You would think they would know a little bit about you to kind of get the ball rolling, but just assume they know nothing. They just invited you on because you're just another name for their show. And before I go on, I want to say something that's probably going to hurt a lot of people's feelings, but it's actually the truth. Are you ready? Here it is. Your podcast guest that you invite on your show does not care about your podcast. Oh, what? How dare you? It's true. And just like that, your podcast listeners to your show do not care about your podcast guest. Okay, hear me out here. I'm going to explain in a little bit. So, assuming you got yourself booked for the show and you're ready to go and you do not know what the show is going to be about, but you're going to roll with the punches and figure it out. Every single podcaster that has a podcast guest on their show would really enjoy and hope that you as the guest has decent sounding audio. Now, what I mean by that is this. Do not come in on a iPhone speaker. Do not come in on a iPad that you're holding in your lap while you're driving your car through rush hour traffic. You have to think about your audio in a way that every single sound around you and sounds you don't even think of are being heard over your content. Do you want the clickety-click sound of something happening outside to be the focus of your interview, or do you want you to be the focus of your interview? Yeah, that's what I thought. You want you and your message to be the focus. So make sure you sound great. And if you have a good podcast host, they will let you know that your audio needs to be tweaked a little bit. And they'll ask you, do you have any other equipment we can use today? Is that the only thing you have? And hopefully it's not. Hopefully you have something decent. A basic Samsung Q2U microphone is about $50 to $70. That will get the job done for almost any situation, for almost any podcast you're going to be on. And if you're going to make the string of podcast interviews, you're going to go the rounds on all these different shows, I would invest in a decent sounding microphone. Not the best. Just a Samsung Q2U will get the job done for every show out there. And that's all you really need to have. Oh, and by the way, have a decent computer with decent internet. Not an iPhone from the woods or, like I said, an iPad from your lap on a train going through Manhattan. No, that's not a good place to do a podcast interview. Think sound and think every single sound around you will be picked up over you. Do you want the chirping of the crickets outside to overpower your message? Do you want them to be the star of your interview? I didn't think so. So going hand in hand with good audio and having a quiet space to physically do the interview, I'm talking turn off your phone, mute your computer, silence all things, no DMs in the background. No, do not be trying to multitask and type up a bunch of emails while you're being a guest for someone else's podcast. They arranged for you to be on there. Show them the respect, show them the decency of being there and showing up 100%, not just your voice or maybe your video camera going and it looks like you're distracted doing other things. No, be present, be available. So there's obviously a very good reason why this podcast wants you to be the guest on their show this week. So what is that one thing that you're there for? It's not because you're pretty looks or because you're famous, although some shows will book you just for those things. You see, with an audio podcast, there's content involved and you have to deliver valuable content for the listeners to want to show up and listen to you in the first place. So what is that? You have to have that story of yours really pinned down and figured out. Whatever it is, it's your kind of your backstory, but don't go too deep into your backstory. We all have a story, the reason why we're here today. That story can be told in multiple different versions. You can have a very quick version, you can have a medium length version, and you can have a very long version, which can be told over, say, an hour interview if that's what you have. Now, you as the guest have to figure out which version you're going to be telling on this show, and don't worry, it can be interchanged any which way because you never know what kind of show you're going to be on, and you never really know what kind of questions the podcast host is going to ask you or which way the conversation is going to steer. Remember, listeners love stories. People connect with stories. So every time a host asks you a question, try to form it in the answer that relates to possibly telling a story of something related to obviously answering the question that they asked you. Now, while you're going back and forth with the podcaster on the questions and answers, try to insert humor, try to insert some banter and some friendly dialogue. People love when people are having a good time. They love hearing that. It's enjoyable to listen to, and it makes it sound like you guys are best friends and you're having a great time. Try to do that. Maybe it's not in your best personality, but try your best to be very, very friendly to not only the podcast host, but also to the people that are listening to this show. You're really talking to both people. You're talking to the podcaster and you're talking to their audience at the same time. So when you answer every question, you kind of have to think about that while you're answering. And also as a podcast guest, just remember that the host, it's their show. It's kind of like going into their house as a guest. Now, if you are a guest in someone else's house, how would you act? How would you respond? You wouldn't go in the place and start trashing the place up. That's what it's like if you were a guest coming on a show with bad audio and dropping vulgar stuff and being super, super rude. You wouldn't do that in real life to someone's house. So don't do it on someone's podcast. Now, it's not live radio. So if you do screw up over something, you always, hopefully, if it's not some kind of live streaming thing, but hopefully the podcaster will fix it in post-production and make you sound amazing. You see, their job is to bring you in, ask engaging questions that tells an amazing story and hopefully relates to the content of the show and delivers amazing value to their listeners. But if you stumble over some words, don't worry about it. Just tell them, oh, I screwed up. And hopefully they can edit that in post-production. Hopefully they edit things in post-production. But like I said, you have to be ready for anything. There could be a show you go on that's got 5 listeners and they do everything raw. No editing, no sound quality, nothing. You go on there, you don't know what you're going to get. Or on the other end, you could have one that's got a showrunner and a manager, and they've got all kinds of prep, and they are well prepared, like a news organization. You got either side of the equation you have to be ready for as a podcast guest. You really have no idea. Okay, so let's just say the interview wrapped up. It was great, and everything was fine and amazing. Now, the podcaster should, after everything's said and done, hang on the line to tell you, oh, that was great. Thank you so much. I will let you know right around the time this episode will be available. Let's say it gets released next Tuesday. I will drop you an email. Can you please share it with your social media? Can you please share this when I send you a link? Can you please share this? And as a podcast guest, you are not obligated to share anything. You are only obligated just to be there for that certain time of day to have the interview. That's where your obligation stops. Now, it's respectful to actually share the episode on your social media with your followers. I was on this show. Check it out. Here you go. It's respectful to do that, but it's not guaranteed. Just like it's kind of respectful to possibly leave a review on that podcast, that one you were just on. Oh, I was just on this show. Great host, great questions, whatever it is. You can leave a quick little review. It's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed. It's just something you do out of respect because both of you gave your time for that sit-down interview for that day. There's a lot of podcast shows that will have guests on their show, and they will run through about as many podcast guests that you can think of in a week or a month. So it gets very hard for them to really keep track of who is who and what is what. So when you do eventually be a guest on that show, try to do something that's spectacular. Really, you want to stand out with your host and with the listeners of that podcast. Be amazing, produce an amazing show, be entertaining, be energetic, be excited about the content that you're delivering for that show. Remember that excitement is contagious. And the more exciting you are for that podcast, the more exciting the listeners are to possibly want to pick up your course or your vacuum cleaner thing or whatever it is you're selling. They may want to check you out because you are exciting and you actually want to be there. It sounds like you want to be there. Don't literally phone it in, as they say. So what did I mean when I said that the podcast guest does not care about your podcast show? What they really care about is getting in front of your audience. That is the only reason they're coming on your show. No, it's not because they want to just meet you. No, it's not because it's the kindness of their heart they want to go on your show. No, a true podcast guest is selling something. They have a message to get out. You have the audience. Put them together. Let's make a deal happen. It's literally like a business contract. It's like you have goods, I have money. Let's make the trade. End of story. That's it. That is the reason they are going to be going on your podcast and eventually onto the next podcast and the next one. The more shows they go on, the more audience they get in front of. And that's why a lot of these podcast guests will try to run through as many shows as possible because they know the value in numbers. The more shows they go on equals the more listeners that listen, and so on and so forth. Now, what I meant by your podcast listener to your show does not care about your podcast guest. I know it sounds harsh. What I mean by that is this. They come to your show for you. You see, you are the common denominator for every single episode out there. You're always there. That guest, well, they're only on that one episode, just one out of 100 or how many episodes you've done so far. They're just there for that one episode. Great. But your podcast subscribers, the one that actually subscribe to your show and download every new episode that comes in, they're there because of you and your show, not the guest show. Now, they may find what the guest says entertaining and valuable, which is great, which is the reason why you bring the guest on in the first place, I would hope. But they are not going to care about your guest tomorrow, after the episode's played, after they've already absorbed whatever value they got from that podcast. Yeah, it was enjoyable. I got value. I appreciate that guest for coming on. Thank you so much. On to the next. I hope these tips and strategies gave you a better idea of what it's like being a podcast guest for a podcaster, what it's like being on the other side of the equation, on the other side of the screen, as it were. Hopefully, this will give you a better understanding what it's like, the steps they have to go through to get to where they are sitting in front of you for that interview. Hey, thank you once again for listening. And if you found any value from listening to this podcast today, maybe you learned something new or something that can benefit your podcast, please share this episode with a friend. Every single podcast player has an app that has a sharing feature built right into it. Just click the little tab and share it with all of your friends that possibly could need to use this information to create a better podcast for them. And I will see you on the next episode.